Justin Mckinney is a researcher and archivist living in the baseball hotbed of Vancouver, British Columbia, hometown, I believe, of Justin Morneau and Larry Walker. Am I right there?
Technically, yeah, but yeah, adjacent, greater Vancouver area.
Close enough.
Yeah.
His book, The First Full-Length History of the Union Association, will be published in 2022. I hope it takes longer to read than the Union Association lasted. And today he's going to talk to us about the forgotten, mysterious, and not terribly good 1875 Brooklyn Atlantics, right?
Yep.
The early professional era, it was a chaotic period for Brooklyn, which had dominated the sport throughout most of the amateur era. You often read that Brooklyn baseball was in decline during the early pro years of the National Association and the National League, but it depends on how you look at it. An immense amount of pro talent flowed from Brooklyn to clubs across the country. The so-called New York Mutuals were a de facto Brooklyn club. Even, as we talked about before, the National League's Hartford Dark Blues relocated to Brooklyn for one season to play at the Union grounds. Not just for the money, they were managed by former Atlantic's Bob Ferguson and featured XA's Joe Start, Jack Burdick, and others. So take it away, Justin. 1875 Atlantics.
Yes. So yeah, I'm just gonna share screen and make this smoothly. Present. Yeah, so we'll just be talking a little bit about the Atlantics of 1875 and from a very specific perspective that reflects my own personal interests in biographical history and tracking down kind of some of the most obscure players in baseball history. We haven't covered too much about the Atlantics and their history, so it's come up tangentially in a bunch of the presentations today, but I mean, they were, probably the first great baseball club. They founded in 1855 and were champion numerous times. They gave birth to some of the first great professional players in Joe Start and Dickie Pierce and folks like that. And they were the first club to visit the White House in 1865 upon commemoration of their winning the championship. And famously, they broke the Cincinnati Red Stockings 89 game winning streak in 1870. So that's the 1865 Atlantics, and that's thought to be one of the first baseball cards. And yeah, nice photo of the club. And yeah, here's a woodcut of the famed game on June 14th, 1870 at the Capitoline grounds. But they went very quickly from being sort of at the pinnacle of baseball to, I don't know, not the pinnacle of baseball, so to speak, and that one of the things that happened is they declined to join the National Association in 1871. And as a result, some of the top players ended up joining other clubs, such as George Zetline and Bob Ferguson and Joe Start and Lip Pike. And when they finally did join in 1872, they did not have many of those star players. And so they've struggled. They went 9-28. They failed to really improve in 1873 with a 17-37 record. In 1874, they went 22-33, which is, again, sort of middle of the pack to lower in the league. The one sort of shining light in the 1874 season was that they recruited Tommy Bond to pitch, and he pitched very well for an 18-year-old, showed a lot of promise as a club ace, and maybe he would be the kind of person that could lead them to success. But then he went to play further along with player manager Bob Ferguson for 1875, and that duo led that club to the second place finish, and we'll see what happens to the Atlantics in 1875 as a result. So yeah, there's some nice photos of Bob Ferguson and Tommy Bond. Atlantic sinking, that's not, I don't even know if it's a pun. I don't know what that is necessarily, but without Bond and Ferguson, the club turned over the pitching duties to John Cassidy, a 19-year-old pitcher, and the managerial duties to Charlie Payboy, who was somewhat of a veteran, had played in all the National Association seasons back to 1871, but they went from bad in 1874 to abysmal in 1875. They posted a 2-42 record. They scored 132 runs, allowed 438. And this gets to sort of the crux of what my presentation will focus on, is the general obscurity of a lot of the players on the club. They used a record 35 players at that time, which was pretty exceptional considering they only played 44 games. And many of the players were plucked kind of from obscurity from Brooklyn neighborhoods that surrounded the Capitoline grounds. the club disbanded in October 1875, and they were not invited to join the National League in 1876. So that's sort of the end of the Atlantics as an entity. Some of the notable names that appeared on the 1875 club were Tommy Bono, who was a very popular catcher. He made one appearance for the club. He's thought to be one of the possible inventors of the bunt, along with Dickie Pierce, and notably he was famously regarded as baseball's first drug addict because he developed a morphine addiction as a result of an injury that may or may not be somewhat of an apocryphal kind of thing, and ended up kind of dissipated into obscurity. Charlie Payboy, he had the original name of the old woman in the red cap, and he was the player manager in 1875. Al Nichols was one of the players that was banned from baseball in the 1877 Louisville scandal. John Cassidy, who was recruited to be the pitcher, he rebounded from the dismal season and had an 11-year career. Doc Bushong made one appearance for the club as a teenager when they were short a bunch of players in Philadelphia, and he became a dentist during his career and was a popular catcher throughout the 1880s and started for the St. Louis Brown Stockings when they were winning world championships. And then Frank Thompson is someone most of y'all have never heard of, but his story is kind of very interesting and reflects sort of some of the research that goes into tracking down some of these odd players. He's only recently discovered, I think in 2018, we finally confirmed his identity and his birth date and his death date. He was born in Portugal in 1852, and he emigrated to America as a teenager. And in 1875, he played for Washington and also appeared for the Atlantics. And then he was a top sort of semi-pro catcher throughout the rest of the 1870s. So there's some photos. It's a nice photo of Charlie Payboy with holding the ball in hand. It leaves with the might be with the Unions in Morrisania at that point, and then Doc Bushong and John Cassidy. And then this is a little bit of like some of the clues we use to find Frank Thompson. You basically search old newspapers, find Thompsons who played catcher around that time, and then you sort of hopefully you can find details. In this case, we found some that confirmed he was from Brooklyn. It even had his height and his weight, which is kind of a useful tool. And then I don't even know how I found this, but I found this odd obituary in the Brooklyn Standard Union for a man named Augustus Fernandez, who went by the name of Frank Thompson when he was in the sporting world. The notice, you might see it sort of apocryphally lists that he was the captain of the Pittsburgh baseball team in the National League in 1885, which was not true. And also that he was the first catcher to receive the curved ball pitched by Candy Cummings. So again, these are pretty outlandish details, but he did actually was a teammate with Candy Cummings on the 1879 Chelsea semi-pro club. And the fact that we were able to find this man on the census, he was actually had some naval records that confirmed he was about 5'3" or 5'4". It's all these pieces put together, and we found this very obscure player, and we're able to confirm his identity. And now he's officially, if you go to Baseball Reference, you can learn all about Frank Thompson. And that brings us to sort of, I don't know, kind of as a baseball researcher, as a biographical researcher who's very interested in trying to track down these strange players, Benjamin Mandelph is kind of a bit of the beta for my existence. He was the sort of financial secretary and business manager of the 1875 Athletics, and he had been involved in a similar role in the 1871 iteration of the club that was played sort of outside of the professional circuit. In 1875, he was tasked with recruiting new players, and as the season progressed and demoralized players jumped from the club, went west, he was tasked with trying to fill out the lineup every game day. But as a result of the team's poor record, the bad reputation, and the continual threat of disbandment, at one point in August, I believe in September, they had essentially disbanded, but then a couple days later, they'd sort of reform and, basically try and play the rest of the schedule. Only players of minimal experience were willing to take chances with the club. They had increasing difficulty finding players who would just be willing to show their faces with such an embarrassing outfit. So then that brings us to sort of the process of how do we identify a missing player? Because in this case, what we have on the Atlantics is there are 35 players, 13 players off of that 35 we don't have proper IDs for, or death dates, or even first names in some cases. So the main way you do it is you try to find an obituary or death record, like we did with Frank Thompson. Hopefully it mentions some details about baseball, maybe an age, an address, a birthplace, and then you can sort of track down that with going through Ancestry.com and try and find census records, things like that. sometimes you can search old newspapers and find addresses for players who organized the team or whatever, and then you can use that to cross-reference with city directories and censuses, and sometimes that's how you found players. And then in certain cases, a player's death might be referenced in another source, but it doesn't have a specific date. So we found a note that says Tom Bono was dead as of 1888, but we don't have an actual death record or a death date to sort of put the nail in the coffin, so to speak. So that leads us to, there's 13 players of the 35 Atlantics who appeared in 1875 who have incomplete records, so to speak. So first off, there's 2 players that are definitively misidentified. So first there's Tom Smith, who he's credited with playing 3 appearances for the Atlantics in September and October 1875, sort of in the last few games of the club's existence. Essentially, he was a player from Guelph, Ontario. He's a well-known Canadian player. He appeared in the International Association in 1877, 1878. But there's one problem with the ID is that he was played in Canada in September 1875. So you can find in the New York Clipper, he's appearing with Guelph at the same time that the Brooklyn Atlantics are playing, and there's no evidence that he came to Brooklyn. So as a result, he should probably be removed from the record book. So it should actually be an anonymous Smith, like a Smith without a first name should be in the record book rather than Tom Smith. And it's unfortunate because as a Canadian, I like to have Canadians in the record book, but we'll have to take him out. The New York Clipper noted that the Athletics player came from the local Nassau club, and the Nassau club had 2 players named Smith. One was an S Smith, one was a D Smith, and you can sort of, there's essentially there was a sort of a year-end recap of the Nassau club in the Christmas Day edition of the New York Clipper in 1875, and it lists the playing records of all the players, and the fact that the club played 25 games, S. Smith played in 24, and many of the games overlap with the appearances that Smith had made with the Brooklyn Atlantics. It means that a likely candidate is played in D. Smith, but trying to find someone named D. Smith in the Brooklyn City Directory in 1875 is not yielded much. And there's in fact quite a few Smiths playing in the area at the time, of course, because Smith is probably the most common last name in the English language. So essentially, he's kind of a needle in a haystack, but maybe someone enterprising will track down something and find something, but it's a tough case. Second case is Fred Crane. He's currently listed as Fred Crane in the Baseball Reference and officially credited with appearances with the Atlantics, but the issue is that Fred Crane was a very well-known player in the 1860s, one of the star players for the championship Atlantics. He's currently credited with an appearance for Elizabeth, New Jersey club in 1873 and with the Atlantics in 1875. But there's some issues with that identification as well. In 1873, the player is listed just with the name Crane in quotation marks, which connotes he was a player played under an alias, and as a result, there's been no leads. And the 1875 player was noted to be Thomas Crane of the Silver Stars, which was a well-known Brooklyn club at that time. And that's confirmed in the January 23rd, 1875 New York Clipper. It's definitely not Fred. And we're able to trace Thomas Crane, or also spelled Cragen or Crayon, so it's a bunch of variations. You can trace him in the city directories through the 1880s, but after that, he's hard to track down due to the common last name and the various spellings of his name. But yeah, we also know that Fred Crane is misidentified in the record book. It should actually be Thomas Crane, but unfortunately, we don't have a proper death date for him. So then that brings us to sort of a category called the Findables, which are people we have significant information on, which can include birth dates, can include full names, and we have prospective death dates, or a rough area of when they might have died, but we don't have a definitive like smoking gun, so to speak. So first up is Molly Moore, who was actually with the club for quite some time. He joined the club on June 30th and was with the club until their final game on October 9th. He played multiple positions. He replaced Thomas Crane after Thomas Crane left the club in June. And he was noted to have joined the club from the Flyaway Club, which is a top club in New York City. And he was a renowned handball and American rackets player, so you can find quite a few references to him in the Clipper about his handball and rackets prowess. There's a death notice that appears for him in the March 26, 1881 New York Clipper, and lists his death date as February 24th, 1881. But because we haven't been able to find him on the census or an official death record, it means we can't officially confirm that that's a correct death date, because there is the issue that you do find incorrect death dates. Sometimes Kobe said, "Oh, he's on his deathbed," and another people will say, "Oh, he died," but we'd still like to have that official confirmation. He's also possibly from Philadelphia as well. There's some notes that say he's from there, but he might also just be from Brooklyn. So he's a findable one. We should be able to find this information, but unfortunately, it's eluded us to date. Then there's John Daly, who he made a couple of token appearances with the club, sort of as a fill-in for Bill Boyd, who was one of the club's top players, but he missed a few games here and there when he traveled back to his home in Philadelphia, I believe. And he played several positions for the club. He joined the club, he joined the Atlantic after he was let go by the Washington club sort of in July. He's a well-known Brooklyn player. We have a woodcut of him, lots of notes on him. He's often referred to as Brock Daly. We have a birth date for him. We have, we know he's married. We can find him in the census, all that sort of stuff. We know he had jobs. We can find references to umpiring as late as 1897. But he was a bad drinker. He had a lot of run-ins with the law, including assaults on women. And so it seems likely he ended up estranged from his family, possibly in an institution or possibly in prison. And from there, it's just, we haven't found like the definitive thing. And again, he's tricky because his name often appears as Daly, but there's variations on the spelling. And so finding the right guy is sometimes tricky, but he's another one where there's ample amounts of information and he should be a findable one. Then we have the famed Tommy Bono, and he made one token appearance for the club. It was actually his final, I believe his final appearance to the National Association, and he made one appearance at second base. He just filled in for Henry Kessler, who had quit the club to go play for Cincinnati. And he's, again, a very well-known player. He was on the club's preseason roster, but evidently didn't join the club. He's the possible inventor of the bunt. He's reputedly baseball's first drug addict. He had a morphine addiction that was brought on by a baseball injury. There's question marks about how valid his account of his injury was, but nonetheless, he obviously had some issues. He possibly had gone insane as well due to concussions, which was a very common fate for catchers at the time, just having a lot of mental health problems because of the amount of blows you take to the head when you're catching fastballs and foul tips without a mask. He spent time in jail and institutions after his career, and he's noted to have died between 1880 and 1888. I know he's one of the most sought after players who still lacks kind of a firm death date in all baseball history, just because of his significance in the development of baseball and significance in the early National Association, and as possible for the bunt, and then also the drug addict aspect is sort of like appeals to the macabre sensibilities that I know I possess, and I'm sure some others do as well. So he's someone that I would really like to find, but again, we have yet to find like a firm death date. So, and then finally, there's Hugh ONeill, who was a pitcher for the club. He joined the club on August 20th, and again was with the club till the end of the season. He was recruited after Al Nichols and Jim Clinton both left the club to go west, which is a common theme. Is a bunch of players kind of started fleeing the club in June and then through September, and so they were left constantly trying to fill in with new players, and that's why they fielded so many players. One note has him being from the Bedford neighborhood in Brooklyn, and then there's a man named Hugh ONeill that umpired a local game in 1876, and so using those pieces of information, we found a possible candidate, which is a man named Hugh Joseph ONeill. Peter Morris, who's one of the most wonderful researchers at this kind of stuff that I can think of. He has a death date for him of March 1st, 1933 in North Castle, New York, but unfortunately the obituary doesn't mention baseball, and there's no smoking gun that confirms it, but he's a really strong candidate because we can place him in the city directories in that neighborhood at that time. And so all those pieces suggest it's probably him, but again, without a final piece of information, we're sort of like missing that extra bit. And then finally, that brings us to this squad of the unidentified players. So there's 7 players on the club who lack first names, which is, I think, in all of baseball history, there's about 35 people in the record book who don't have a first name, and these are 7 of them. So it's very fascinating to try and track down information on such obscure players. And generally, as a rule, if someone's remained unidentified for 140 years, there's a good reason why. And so this is one of those things. So first up is a man named Hellings. He made one appearance on July 19th, 1875. And this game was unusual because it's a road game. It was in Philadelphia. And he was recruited sort of probably as one of the hangers on that would go to the ball games and just kind of float around and stuff like that. He was recruited when 5 regulars didn't show up for the game in Philadelphia. And so they recruited, a bunch of local players from local clubs. And unfortunately, Hellings, his first name was never listed in any of the notes. I've spent a lot of time on this guy. And we know he's almost certainly from Philadelphia just because of proximity and the fact that the players who appeared in the game were also Philadelphia players. I recently found a note in the Philadelphia City item, which I was provided courtesy of Richard Hirschberger. And I found a player named Jay Hellings, who appeared for some semi-pro clubs. And then there's a player named Hellings who appears with semi-pro clubs in the 1860s. He's playing alongside Outreach and players like that. And then he also appeared in the 1877 League Alliance. And so using that information, I found this candidate because there's not that many Hellings in the Philadelphia city directories at the time. And I found a Jonathan W. Hellings who was born in 1847, which would make him old enough to be the player in the 1860s. And, young enough to be the player in the 1860s, but not too young to appear at that time. And he was born in 1847, so he would have been about 20 around when he started playing baseball, would have been about 26, 27 when he made his one appearance for the Athletics. And coincidentally, he lived 10 minutes from Philadelphia's Jefferson Street ballpark. And so it seems likely that this is the best candidate we have at the moment. But again, his obituary makes no mention of baseball, and we haven't found anything that says Jonathan Hellings and things like that. And it's a bit tricky to firmly identify, but he's another one who I think is more findable than the rest just because we know he's from Philadelphia and the last name's fairly unusual. That brings us to Boland. He made one appearance on September 4th, 1875. He was described as an amateur that Benjamin Mandelph had picked up to try and fill in after Clinton and Nichols and Kessler had quit the club and a couple more players were absent. He played third base in one game. There's a pair of players in the 1860s named Joseph P. Boland and C. Boland. I wasn't able to find first name. They were playing in the 1860s in Brooklyn. You can find some notes about them. So it could be one of those guys. And then there's a couple pair of Bolands playing for the Troy Putnam Club around 1870. But again, we don't have anything else. And Boland isn't a super common name, but the fact that we don't have any sort of first initial that sort of appeared around that time in 1875, it means it's kind of tricky to track down. And haven't found him as a member of any clubs in 1875, and that's also another red flag. It's a lot of the players that are more findable. You can sort of find multiple records of them playing for clubs in New York City and in Brooklyn around 1874 through 1877, and you can search box scores and try and build up some information and maybe find some clues. But Boland has been elusive to date. Then Quinn, he made a couple appearances starting September 9th and ending on September 17th. He played shortstop and played in the outfield. He replaced Hugh ONeill in the starting lineup, and he was a local semi-pro of some repute. He had played on the Flyaways club that Molly Moore had played on. And just looking at notes in the New York Clipper, you can find a lot of references to a Quinn playing shortstop. I found him listed as M. Quinn. I also found a Michael Quinn, who was listed as being from Brooklyn. And so I suspect it's a player named Michael Quinn. He played for local clubs through 1877. He also played in the League Alliance in 1877. And he likely played for the Jersey City Browns in 1878 and 1879, where he's played alongside a lot of other Brooklyn players. And so I suspect it's a player named Michael Quinn. I found a musician in the census and the city records named Michael J. Quinn, who's the right age to be the ball player, but again, nothing to confirm it's him, and I haven't found an obituary that is definitely the guy, and so he remains elusive, but we're almost certainly looking for a player named Michael Quinn. It's just a matter of which Michael Quinn. Again, oftentimes the issue is that the last names are very common and the first names are also common. So there's lots of Michael Quinns, there's lots of there's lots of Smiths and things like that, and so it's tricky to track down these guys for a reason. Then there's a pitcher named Edwards who made one appearance on September 11th, 1875, and he appeared alongside Frank Thompson on trial, and they replaced Quinn and Al Martin in the lineup, and I guess it was just to give John Cassidy a rest from pitching, and I guess with their futility, it didn't really matter who took the box because they just had to get the games in somehow. It was kind of like a death march at that point. They're just on their last legs. No one's really interested. They're kind of a joke. and they're just getting anyone they can to fill in. So he started giving him a pitcher, and what's interesting about him is they noted in the box score in the game accounts in the Clipper that he threw so hard that neither catcher Jacob Nodell or Frank Fleet could catch him, and so he was moved to center field in the second inning. And so that's interesting, is that you have this hard-throwing pitcher who is sort of plucked from obscurity and is throws so hard that the catchers can't handle them, and yet no one thinks to note that maybe that's something you could harness and figure out. And so with him, the common last name makes it difficult. The only other Edwards I found pitching in the New York area, I found one box score in 1874 where a pitcher named Edwards appeared for New York University. But again, since that's the only one I know of in the New York City area, but that's the only box score I could find. And the university clubs at that point weren't nearly as formalized, where sometimes they play exhibition games or sometimes they play games where player was not a member of the university and would just appear. And so this really hard tracking down a suitable candidate based on the commonality of the last name. And then there's a player named Schaeffer who played in the outfield, right field, on September 15th. He replaced Frank Thompson, and he was noted in game accounts to be an employee of W.C. Kammerer, who had owned the Mutual Club. He made a nice running catch in the outfield according to the box score, so that suggests maybe he had some baseball acumen. But the difficulty is his last name is tricky to find spellings of, because he's listed in different box scores as Schaeffer with two F's, Shear, and Schaeffer with a CH. And so that makes it very difficult to find a suitable person. And I've checked census directories and city directories and censuses, and I haven't found anything way to connect someone named Schaeffer to W.C. Kammerer. And we know it's not Orator Schaeffer, who was appearing for Philadelphia on the same day. And so he's one who I think that clue is very provocative and very interesting, but again, it's difficult to use on anything. And again, the variations of spelling of these names makes them really difficult to track down. And then there's a player named Stoddard. He played a couple games September 25th and appeared in the final game on October 9th. He played in the outfield. He joined the club because Charlie Payboy and John Cassidy had both quit the club. There's a pair of ball-playing brothers named Charles and Walton Stoddard, but they were living in Poughkeepsie, New York, and you can find lots of notes of them playing in Poughkeepsie at the time that this Stoddard was playing. And so we have nothing to place them in Brooklyn in fall of 1875. And then there's a player named Charles Stoddard who's playing for the Tuttle and Bailey Club, which was the top semi-pro club in Brooklyn in summer 1875. So it's likely the guy we're looking for. And he also appeared in 1876 for the Brooklyn Semi-Pro Club that sort of reformed out of the ashes of the Atlantics. And in 1883, there's a man named Charles Stoddard who umpired the last game in history of the Brooklyn Effort Club. So we suspect the player is a man named Charles Stoddard, either with a T or a D on the end. But again, that's one that should be findable, but it's been difficult to identify a firm candidate. One of the candidates that I felt very confident in, it turns out he was actually blind at the time. So while it might have helped him as an umpire, it wasn't a suitable quality for a ball player, even on the 1875 Brooklyn Atlantics. So it's definitely not that guy. And so he's one, yeah, I think it's findable, but again, it's tricky. There's a reason why we haven't found these guys. And then finally, there's a man named Sheridan who made one appearance on October 9th, 1875, played in left field. He replaced William Rexter in the lineup. There's absolutely zero information on this guy. Sheridan, there's a lot of Sheridans in the city directories. I cannot find another Sheridan playing baseball at that time in Brooklyn or in New York City or anywhere else. And so as a result, there's no leads to suggest who this guy might be. And I'd argue he's probably the most unfindable of the players on the 1875 Atlantics. So yeah, he's just one who I don't think will be found, unfortunately. So then what's next? We know Tommy Bono is one of the most sought after missing players due to his reputation and place in baseball history. I would recommend that Fred Crane and Tom Smith, the records be amended to Thomas Crane, and Smith just take up the first name and he's currently unidentified. Thomas Crane, Tommy Bono, John Daly, Molly Moore, and Hugh ONeill are all just missing the final piece of information to confirm their death dates. So I suspect they will be found at some point. And then Smith, Hellings, Stoddard and Quinn all have likely first names and at least an initial in the case of Smith, and Hellings as well. And then Schaeffer, it might be findable based on the Klubo's employment. Boland and Edwards both have possible leads, but they're pretty limited. And I would say only Sheridan's probably truly unfindable based on the current sources. And I believe that concludes everything. Sorry, I'm just unsharing here. So yeah, that is the fate of the Brooklyn Atlantics.
You really dug deep to come up with what you know. How can you say it? It's something that I know earlier last week or earlier this week, Larry Phillips did a presentation on early baseball in Cincinnati. And he discovered this game, you know, but he went through a very similar experience of saying, I really can't discern like most of who these players were, you know, and it's incredible. So the Atlantics, having been at one point the pinnacle team in the National Association of Baseball Players, entered the National Association of Professional Baseball Players. By 1875, they're at the bottom of the heap.
Yeah, maybe the worst baseball team of all time at that point. So,
They were,
like
what
professional,
were they,
worst major league club of all time.
yeah, what were they, 9 and 28?
They went 2 and 42.
Okay. So, all right. So I have a couple of questions here. From David Dyke. I'm not sure what it. Let's see what it says. Well, first let me start with Eric. He says, what John Thorne says, I love your work. He loved the research you did on this because it had to be exhaustive. Larry Hayes, thanks for, well, he says he uses the word exhaustive. Thanks for your exhaustive research. Justin, going back for nearly a century and a half isn't something that most of us handle with your thoroughness and evolve, and that is true. David Dowd, outstanding work. Tom, fun stuff. I may have something on Helling. We'll check. That's John Thorne.
Much
So
appreciated.
maybe you'll hear from him.
Yeah, yeah.
And David Dyke called it a death march. It was really apropos, presaging the great spiders of 1899, which we all know that reputation. So interesting. Your tenacity is impressive. This can't be easy research, and that is absolutely the truth. So they were Brooklyn's first bombs.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I like your title. There's just one little story about a fellow who comes into New York by train, and he grabs a cab, and as he gets in the cab, the cab driver has, this is back in the 40s, the cab driver has on the radio, and he has the game on of the Brooklyn Dodgers playing. So the passenger says, "Oh, you got the game on. How are the Dodgers doing?" And he says, "They got 3 men on base." And the passenger says, "Which base?"
Yeah.
So I think the Atlantics were their rivals, 1875.
Yeah. Well, and the interesting thing is, if you just look at the preseason roster, it's filled with players who had played in the National Association, and like it wasn't just like nobodies, but obviously the lack of pitching just led to such futility. And then the players start fleeing and heading west and find opportunities. Like some players end up in Cincinnati and Louisville, and then you have they're just trying to fill out the roster for the last few games. At one point, they disband the club, but then a couple days later, they're like, okay, we'll start the club again, and then just fill it in with whoever they can find. And then by the end, they're just not even picking players who are like reputed semi-pros or they play for other clubs. They're just grabbing people who we don't even know who they are. Maybe it's just you have
having read Bill Rysack's Black Cards and Red Stockings. You go back to teams like the Resolutes. 1870. I mean, they like disappear like after 22 games or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What makes you think? Well, what made you think? How do you think the Atlantics of 1875 played that deep into the season? What do you think drove them to
I don't know necessarily what kept them going, but I mean, they eventually they stopped going on the road. So after July, I think they played the rest of their games at home, and they're only playing one game every week or two. And so they played the bulk of their games early in the season, did the usual road trips, and then by the end they're just staying at home. And I think the fact that they're filling in, the top players have left, so they're not paying them anymore. They're probably just grabbing guys off the street, so to speak, to probably play for. I don't know how much a guy would get for just showing up at the ballpark, and you
Right.
play right field today. You know, I don't know how much you get for that, but maybe nothing, or just you get the thrill of being in a ball game. I don't know. So I think it was just the fact that they cut their costs and just finished the
and you
season.
know, you had that guy in Chicago, William Holbert, looking at all of that.
Yeah.
They're probably licking his chops, saying, I think we could do this better.
Yeah. Oh, undoubtedly, yeah.
Well, thank you so much again for your exhaustive research.
My pleasure.
Tom, we're going to pick up tomorrow. Everybody here, just so you know, you will receive about 8 a.m. tomorrow morning a second login link for the Zoom meeting. And you want to zoom in a little before 12:30, when Tom is going to commence with his video recorded tour of historic baseball. And Tom, how long do you think that portion will run, the video portion?
It's about 42 minutes.
Okay, so we're at the 42 minutes of Tom's on tour, that video tour, which I'm really looking forward to. Then he will come back live and have your questions ready, because Tom will answer a lot of what you may have questions about after observing his tour.